we have less than 1 hour, so we'll do like a small interview for 20 minutes. I'll ask some questions. Vijay will answer them as he does, and then we'll have some questions from the public, 3-4 questions, and then after that, an organization called Manifiesta will join us to talk about the Afghan refugees, and somebody from Afghanistan will also testify to talk about how he looks at the situation and what he experiences here in Belgium as an Afghan refugee. So that's basically what we'll do today. So Vijay, welcome to the table, to the stage, to the conference. Let me just start with the first question. Imagine that the discourse that the United States used on Afghanistan, we were there to promote human rights, we're going to build up a nation, freedom, so on and so on. Imagine that the discourse is true. How did it end up? Was it a success or another failure?
Well, good morning. There's a couple of things that I think are important. I have, reported the war in Afghanistan in the early period. In the 2000s, got the opportunity to interview a number of people who were in the Afghan government between 1978 and 1990, including the Minister of Social Affairs, Anahita Ratebzad, who went into exile in Bulgaria, and then she was lived in Dortmund in Germany in exile. I built up an understanding of Afghanistan talking to Anahita actually more than anything. She was one of the first women in the Afghan parliament in 1965. She was the founder and leader of the Democratic Federation of Women of Afghanistan, a member of their People's Party, their communist organization. She was, as I said, a minister of social welfare, extraordinary person. And early on in our conversations, I discovered that there's a real misunderstanding of Afghanistan, because it's a country which had a long period of struggles to transform its society, its culture, going back to the 1910s, 100 years ago, under King Amanullah and Queen Soraya. There was an attempt to move an agenda inspired not by the West, but by the developments taking place in Turkey as the Ottoman Empire fell apart. Queen Soraya was the daughter of a woman born in Damascus in 1877, highly influenced her family by the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire. All of that history was brought to Afghanistan in 1990. You're wondering, why am I saying all this to answer your question?
Curious.
Because, you see, Afghanistan had a constitution in 1923, constitution in, I think, 64, a series of constitutions till 1990. In each of these constitutions, it declared the equality of all people, men and women. It had all kinds of far-sighted approaches. At the same time, right after King Amanullah declared the first constitution, Queen Soraya opened a girls' school in Kaboel. After this period, Amanullah exchanged letters with Lenin. Lenin made it clear, and in fact, when the Soviet Union conducted the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 with the Axis powers and others, the Russians made it clear, the Soviets made it clear, they said in that treaty that Persia and Afghanistan must remain independent. People don't remember that, but the Soviets insisted on the independence of Afghanistan, which is a reason why Afghanistan didn't have a communist party until the 1960s, because Soviets didn't want to interfere in developments in Afghanistan. Well, in the 1950s, it was the USSR that paved all the roads in Kaboel. There was a lot of Soviet influence in Afghanistan right through till the 1960s. In the 1960s, the United States government, now coming to your question, decided to undermine the influence of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan by supporting some of the most hideous political forces inside Afghanistan. there was a man by the name of Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was a professor of Islamic theology at Kaboel University. And his two students, they were the main people, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud. They developed a reputation in Kaboel University of attacking women who had come to study and so on. Ahmad Shah Massoud is a curious figure because later he gets lionized, including by the French Parliament and so on. But he was a nasty piece of work as a student, as a member of the Jamaat-e-Islami and so on. And these people were under pressure not by the communist government from 1978 or by the Soviet intervention in 79, but in 1971-72, when Muhammad Dawood, who was a liberal royal, came back to power in Afghanistan, Muhammad Dawood decided to put pressure on the Jamaat-e-Islami to restrict their ability to, for instance, attack girls at the University of Kabul. And Rabbani and Hekmatyar and Massoud and so on went across the border to Pakistan in 1973. That's 5 years before the communists take power. Just remember this, it's important. Fully backed by the United States, the Saudis, later by the Pakistani dictatorship of Zia-ul-Haq and so on, these horrible, marginal, vicious people became powerful. And they were able to then, in a sense, distort the social development of Afghanistan. So when the United States actual record is judged, it should not be judged based on this 20-year occupation alone. It should be judged from its intervention in Afghanistan from the 1960s, when it made an alliance with these wretched forces, these right-wing forces, built them up, and then delegitimized the left deeply, and made it seem as if left-wing ideas are alien to Afghanistan. You know what's alien to Afghanistan? Is the Wahhabite Saudi ideas that are now at center stage with the Taliban, brought in by petrodollars, you know, the dollars of Saudi Arabia by its oil fields and so on. That has come in and distorted Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a very interesting place with its own very powerful history. Didn't need that. You know, it had its own development. From Amanullah onward, decent civilization was being produced. And the United States, for reasons of power, destroyed that process and allowed this ghastly process from the Mujahideen to the Taliban to now come and dominate Afghanistan. And you know, Afghanistan doesn't need anybody's pity or charity or all of that. It needs solidarity against imperialism, because this is the crime scene of 20th and 21st century imperialism.
Could you elaborate on that? Because I mean, I think people in this room are quite curious about the actual consequences of the 20-year occupation on all statistics of any like metric to look at social progress in the country, for example.
Okay, great. You know, amazing. Okay, because we know that the United States government spent $2.26 trillion in the last 20 years. That's a lot of money. I don't know what percentage of Belgian GDP is, but I'm guessing it's a lot more than Belgian GDP. 400 times?
4 times.
4 times. Well, yeah, Belgian GDP. 4 times Belgian GDP spent on this 20-year occupation. Meanwhile, latest statistics, United Nations data, also Afghan government just before the Taliban came in, their data. Half the population in Afghanistan is in poverty and struggling with hunger. Food security or food sovereignty at a virtual zero level. More significant than that, 3/4 of Afghans don't have access to electricity. What did you spend $2.26 trillion? You didn't build any power lines. You didn't repair the power company. How can you have children go to school? How can you have statistics of education if there's no electricity? Because like I was a child, I studied for my last year exams with a lantern, you know, thermocol lantern. I mean, if we had lights, I would not be a socialist, maybe. I would have studied my textbooks and studied economics and gone in a more lucrative direction. Unfortunately, I did very badly in my exam because I studied with that stupid lantern. You can't have actual education in those conditions. When children are hungry, there's a noise in their head. They can't study. That's one. Secondly, 6-8 months before Taliban took power now, no, sorry, sorry, I'm wrong. After Ashraf Ghani was installed as the president of Afghanistan, thanks to the United States government, by the way, his vice president, Mr. Saleh, who is now pretending he's leading a resistance in the Panjshir Valley, Mr. Saleh was basically working for the CIA for this entire period since 2001, and then he was the head of Afghan intelligence during Hamid Karzai's government, and then became vice president with Ashraf Ghani. No legitimacy that government had. Anyway, the education minister, after coming into office as Ashraf Ghani's education minister, looked at statistics of education in Afghanistan. I found this report very interesting. See, and I don't know why journalists, like I'm a journalist. I don't know why my colleagues don't read these reports. They just don't take seriously when governments release reports, like governments of Afghanistan. They take whatever US government says, they are ventriloquists. They parrot whatever the Pompeos and the Blinkens say. But when Afghan speaks, they don't actually report this earnestly and seriously. This guy, who basically, was a World Bank education minister, nonetheless, still he said that under Hamid Karzai's government, there was a report done about 5 years ago that said about 11 million children are in school. He said, we find these numbers wrong, that actually only 6 million are in school. Then I dug around a little bit and I thought, how did they come to the 11 million number? This is fascinating. They came to the 11 million number because the number of chairs that were contracted into Afghanistan for schools. So there are photographs taken by NGOs of these chairs piled up in empty rooms. Because they were sold and contractor made millions of dollars, but the children are sitting in the chairs. So if you count chairs sold for children in schools, there's 11 million children in schools. If you actually look, I don't even know if it's 6 million in schools. Because again, 3/4 country, no electrification. You are worrying in places like Belgium about lockdowns. You are worrying perhaps about the digital divide. How can you even worry about digital divide when you don't have electricity? Imagine that. That's $2.26 trillion sold for this occupation, and 3/4 of Afghans don't have access to sustained electricity. Now you tell me, who is bringing civilization to whom?
You bring it up, discourse versus reality. There are like separate things in this discussion, in this what's going on at the moment. Now, the US and the West were in Afghanistan supposedly to fight terrorism, to get rid of the Taliban, to get rid of Osama bin Laden, but the objectives, the goalposts were always set a bit further. Now, why were we really there? Is there something else?
Well, let's take the United States government at its word. It was there to disrupt Al-Qaeda, destroy Al-Qaeda, and as George Bush said, anybody who harbors Al-Qaeda, which was technically the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, government being the Taliban. Those were the two stated war aims. Let's take them seriously. In October of 2001, the government of Mullah Omar, the Islamic Emirate government, in a back channel told the United States, we will not hand over bin Laden to you, but if you give a dossier of information that implicates bin Laden in the attacks 20 years ago yesterday, September 11th, we will hand him over to a neutral country, a Muslim country, that's how they phrased it, where he can be tried. But we will not hand him over to you directly. So they made an offer. That's interesting. You see, after 20 years, the Taliban is back in power. Imagine if 20 years ago, the United States government said, okay, fine, here's the dossier, send him to Saudi Arabia, or whatever, I suppose they would have sent to Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden, after all, was not person non grata in Saudi Arabia, because he's a Saudi prince. You should remember, out of the 19 people who were known to have hijacked planes in the United States, I think some 16 of them were Saudi nationals, then some Egyptians and others, but 16 odd Saudi nationals. So they said, we will send him, but not like this. And the United States refused. So the United States started a bombing campaign October 2001. Al-Qaeda largely disappeared across the border to Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and maybe some to Iran. But they went across the border. There was some real destruction, like the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, its entire leadership was wiped out in the bombing. So there was some disruption of Al-Qaeda network. But largely they went across the border. In fact, Bin Laden went to Tora Bora, as far as we know, crossed and was living in Abbottabad for 10 years after that. Okay, so Al-Qaeda went over. Now, did Al-Qaeda's terrorism decrease? Yes, it decreased against the United States mainland, but it is metamorphosized. So that, for instance, I was in Kalamun region in Syria, and I encountered Al-Qaeda of the Levant, that then became ISIS. They split and became ISIS. I encountered them in the Kalamun region in 2013. This is now, 12 years after the United States started bombing in Afghanistan. So, number one objective was not met. Al-Qaeda still exists in all kinds of places, including in Pakistan, where it is very disruptive, in Waziristan, in northern Balochistan, and so on. Secondly, destroy the Taliban. Moment the US started bombing, Mullah Baradar got on his scooter, told Mullah Umar, get on the back. They rode across the border, arrived in Peshawar. Eventually came back to Afghanistan in the summer. Most of the Taliban went back home, put their guns under the bed and disappeared. That was in October. Then the first summer of 2002, there was some small forays of Taliban attacks at US movement. But by the summer of 2003, the Taliban was back. And it did not have to do with the US moving to its illegal war in Iraq. It had to do with the Taliban regrouping. It was back by 2003. Second objective, get rid of the Taliban. Not really, because they are back in Kaboel now. Now, interestingly, in 2010, the New York Times published a leaked report. You see, at the time, Hamid Karzai's Minister of Mines made a statement to the press saying there's $3 trillion of resources under the soil in Afghanistan. We don't think about it. Think of it as a poor country. It's a very wrong opinion. Afghanistan is extremely rich with all kinds of resources, including copper. But this Pentagon US military report leaked to the New York Times called Afghanistan the Saudi Arabia of lithium. I thought that was just charming. Saudi Arabia of lithium. $3 trillion worth of minerals and precious metals and rare earth minerals in Afghanistan. Secondly, there was this long urge to build a pipeline from Turkmenistan through eastern Afghanistan, maybe near Herat, down into Balochistan. There was a long period when an Argentinian company called Bindas had signed the agreement with the Turkmenistan government, with the Taliban, and with the Pakistani government. The US government, under Robin Raphael and others on the ground in Pakistan, put a lot of pressure on the government in Turkmenistan and on the Taliban to break the deal with Bindas and sign with UNOCAL. In fact, the Taliban had visited the United States, had come to Houston, Texas, to try to see, will UNOCAL have a better deal? There were lots of things on the agenda. You know, I'm not one of those people who believes every war is specifically for oil, or specifically for lithium, but those things are on the table. This particular war was about getting Al-Qaeda, getting the Taliban. The United States failed in its objective. If you just merely judge it by its own self-stated objectives, they failed. What they've succeeded in doing is creating chaos in Asia. This doesn't hurt the US directly, but it hurts Asia. This is going to be terrible for Central Asia. It's going to be terrible for the Pakistanis, because I'm telling you, in the current government in Kaboel, the vice president and two other ministers are from the Haqqani network. Sirajuddin Haqqani is now basically number 2 in the government. Khalilul Haqqani is, I think, the minister of refugees. Anas Haqqani was supposedly the mediator between Hamid Karzai, Abdullah and the Taliban. This is the Haqqani network. This is a declared terrorist organization by the United Nations. They conduct so many violent attacks inside Pakistan. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the Taliban affiliate, is going to be emboldened now. So this is not this is humiliating for the US, but we will pay the price. We will pay the price in Asia. This is an open sore. Few months before 9/11, what the US calls 9/11, the Chinese called a meeting in Central Asia and created the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The purpose of the SCO was to deal with the threat of the Taliban. And now, I don't know what's going to happen vis-a-vis the Chinese, Imran Khan's government in Pakistan and the Taliban. You know, there were protests on the streets of Kaboel attacking the Pakistanis for their role in what's happening here. It's a very tense situation, friends. It's a very tense situation. I frankly don't want to see more CIA assistance for some other group to fight the Taliban. Because the last thing the Afghans need is more bloodshed. We need to find a way for political pressure. We need to find a way to basically build a process in and around Afghanistan. But good God, the last thing the Afghan people need is for new night goggles, new Stinger missiles to enter, Ahmad Massoud's quixotic campaign in Panjshir to go and fight the Taliban. I think that's a disaster. Let there be at least some time of relative peace. I understand it's not peace for the Afghan people, because the Taliban have their own crazy ideas of how they are already ruling. It's not peace for the people. But the last thing they need is more B-52s bombing them, more Stinger missiles, more chaos.
You mentioned it at the beginning of this discussion. Afghanistan knows a history of social reform. It's part of that history. How can we support that history from here as an anti-imperialist movement, let's say?
Look, this is a complication thing for all countries where the United States has essentially gone and ejected the left. Look at Indonesia. I mean, in 1965, the US government colluded with the worst elements in Indonesia, and the military and the Australian government colluded with them, and they massacred 1 million communists and communist sympathizers. 1 million people were massacred in Indonesia in 1965. 1964, US government green-lighted a coup in Brazil, and they executed large parts of the left. We forget about these things. Yesterday was September 11th. They green-lighted a coup in Chile in September 11th. Pinochet came in the stadium. They executed the left. The comrades from the Mir and others were executed in daylight. People cheered on this execution. In 1978, when the communist government came in Afghanistan, there was a lot of problems in that government. There were infighting in the leadership between Hafizullah Amin and Karmal, the Khalq and Parcham factions and whatnot. But the great pressure was coming to them across the border from Peshawar, and this was these Mujahideen fighters backed by the US, Saudis and so on. It's at that point that Tariqi and then Amin and all talked to the Soviets and said, we need your help. The reason, after a year of deliberation, the reason the Soviets crossed the Amu Darya with great trepidation, they didn't want to do that, is they feared what had happened in Indonesia, what had happened in Brazil, what had happened in Chile would be repeated in Afghanistan, that there would be a bloodbath. In fact, whether the Soviets came or not, there was a bloodbath. Lots of communists, firstly, Hafizullah Amin, one of the leaders of the Khalq faction, killed a lot of communists himself in that very short period when he was in charge of the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. Very destabilizing influence, this man. That's also true, we should admit it. There were problems in the left, but apart from anything else, the left and sensitive people were really damaged not only by the Soviet period, but by the civil war that came after the Soviets left, that was engineered by Hekmatyar, again Ahmad Shah Massoud, these same men. They were involved in a terrible fratricidal civil war. So many of the friends I had in Kaboel, in Mazar-e-Sharif, in Kandahar, moved to India. They moved to Germany, like Anahita Ratevzad and so on. They took refuge elsewhere. A lot of the former left lives outside the country. But let me tell you, in Kaboel, you'll meet the people of the left. They are still there. During the US occupation, they formed NGOs, they formed civil society groups, charities and so on. But they are too scared to establish themselves as a left because they will all be executed. So it's not a joke, but we have to find a way, creative way. And I'm sorry I don't have any suggestions right now. Because let me ask you, in all these countries, in Eastern Europe, where basically left is banned, how does one help our friends build a legitimate left forces? And so it's very difficult. We are in a really tough position in many parts of the world. Right now we are just fighting for decency. Decency as a prelude to socialism.
Lots of info there. I would like to move to the questions in the room. So raise your hand if you do have a question. You can come to the front or maybe just speak out loud. We'll take 3 questions at a time and then Vijay will answer them.
Ga je het in het Nederlands zeggen? Hè?
Ja, you can. Ja.
Hij praat nu vooral over politiek. Ik volg nu al een aantal jaren families die uit Afghanistan overkomen, die gevlucht zijn. Maar die weten niks van die politiek. Die zijn gewoonweg gevlucht omdat het niet anders kon. Hoe staat hij daar tegenover? Want dat gaat over plattelandsmensen. Hè? Die weten niks van communisme, die weten niks.
Yeah, I'll translate quickly. So he has had contact with Afghan families here in Belgium for a couple of years now. They fled their country, not realizing what was going on in the country, not being aware of any politics of the country. You've talked a lot about the politics of the country, and there's this disparity for him between what you say and what they experience as people coming from rural areas in Afghanistan and so on. So what do you make of that? That would be the first question. Mevrouw?
I worked in Afghanistan with an organization called Mothers for Peace. And, well, you said, and other people said, what we have to do is look at what we can do and what we have to do in Belgium. The people who work for Mothers for Peace were working with a foreign organization, so they were in danger. So some of them are here now. And what did Sami Mehdi do? He invited them for lunch, you know, and it was on social media. But instead of giving them what they had promised and what I discussed with one of the lawyers of Progress Law, if they had had a real humanitarian visum, then they could start here. But no, it's again, you know, the long process and what is going to happen, etc., etc., etc. So I think at least, and those people, even if they're villagers, and I doubt it, I think even those villagers, they know why we had to fly. My ex-students, when I was teaching in Okam, it's the classes for the newcomers, they knew why they were sent away by their father, because their father was a village elder, and he tried to help the people, so his sons were in danger. So most people know why they have to fly, and if they have any opportunity to stay, they stay on. If they think they will not be known, then they stay. So I think in Belgium, I don't know what you would propose, but we have to start not stopping to hide the truth. Let those people feel safe enough to tell the truth, at least here. And then let's take it up for them. I went to a meeting in Antwerp of young girls, but you know, they want money, but they don't know what for. So let them get organized and feel safe here, because as a political refugee, you are in fact not allowed to talk about politics in Belgium.
Do you have a question for Vijay?
Yeah. So what do you think of it? What would you advise? What can we do here? You know, without talking about party politics, we can talk about humanitarianism.
Yeah, go ahead.
Vijay, you mentioned legitimate forms of political pressure on the Taliban government. And today we see Afghani funds frozen by the US and European countries. What do you think about that? Is it just more sanctions to the Afghani people will be more impoverished, or is that a legitimate kind of political pressure?
3 questions, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm a journalist, not an anthropologist, so I can't answer directly how particular people feel about their stories or so and so. But I very much agree with you that when a structure, a society welcomes refugees and says that we want you merely to be people who have had a very bad experience, and we want to shelter you, but you can't speak politically. I think that itself is a human rights crime. That a person who's brought into a country as a refugee should be free to say whatever they want. Because after all, you have the freedom to say what you want. Why should a refugee have their freedoms curtailed? That itself is peculiar to me. I didn't realize that was a requirement of being a refugee is that you should be quiet. So I don't know why, maybe they don't feel safe to talk about their own politics. I'm a journalist, so I see things in a certain way. My experiences are different, and so I wouldn't want to ventriloquize for them. You know, we would have to ask them what they think or fear. I don't know what the gaps are.
They think nothing. They
Ja.
think nothing. Het enige waarvoor dat zij hier zijn is omdat zij gevlucht zijn, omdat zij voor Amerikaanse soldaten of voor militairen gewerkt hebben en dat zij vrezen voor hun leven. Maar voor de rest.
Yeah, he says that the only reason why they are here is because they fear for their lives because they supported the American military, soldiers and so on in Afghanistan.
I mean, that's a good enough political reason. They made a political choice to support the US soldiers. And that's a question, you know. If you are in an occupied country and you support the occupying power, if the occupying power is defeated, you would fear for your life. I would imagine that. I mean, yesterday I made the point about anybody who collaborates with an occupying power in any country, whether it's in France during the Nazi occupation or whatever, think about how the rest of society sees it.
I think that.
Well, but money is, you know, look at the things we ask our children not to do for money. You know, I told my children when they were young, be decent people. I don't care if you're rich or whatever. I prefer that you're a decent person than be a multimillionaire. And I know survival is different from multimillionaire, but people make choices. I mean, would I work as an interpreter for the US military when they went to torture people? I hope not. I hope not. And so these are choices people make. I don't want to judge anybody, but I am making a broad judgment. I don't know their particular stories. In terms of what is legitimate pressure and so on, the Taliban went to the Central Bank of Afghanistan on the 16th of August and they said, how much money do we have in the bank? And the bank officials said to them, there's nothing, because our $9.6 billion in external holdings that we have are sitting in the New York Federal Reserve Bank. We are holding our own money in the New York banking system, so we don't have access to it. And when the Taliban asked the Americans, well, can we access our funds? They said, no, we've shut off your funds from you. Now, I don't like the Taliban at all. In fact, I don't like any theocratic government. On the other hand, to shut off their funds from themselves is a strange situation. The IMF decided we are not going to write any checks to you, even during the pandemic. This means that 38 odd million Afghans are going to be cut off from international financing. That is not legitimate pressure. That's terrorism against the Afghan people. What's legitimate pressure? I would like to see a conference called immediately of all the neighboring countries where they have to sit down and they have to talk frankly and freely. You know, I would like to see India and Pakistan talk frankly and freely about stopping using Afghanistan as a battlefield between Indian and Pakistani interests. And I'm an Indian, so I'm saying it from that standpoint. I would like to see the Chinese have a serious conversation with the other Central Asian countries, the Pakistanis and so on, about what is the Belt and Road going to mean, you know, with the Taliban government in Kaboel. What was the deal made in Tianjin between Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, and Mullah Baradar on the 28th of July this year? That is 2 weeks before the Taliban took Kaboel. These are things that need to be hashed out in a regional conference. We don't want NATO to be in that meeting. We don't want the United States to be in that meeting. We want the regional countries to sort it out. Let Taliban understand that it lives in a region. It's a landlocked country. It will rely on Iran. It will rely on the countries on the other side of the Amu Darya. It will rely on China. It will rely on Pakistan. It will rely on India. Let the Taliban come to terms with that. Let Pakistan as well come to terms with the fact that it's played a very dirty game with the so-called Durand line, the so-called border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is not agreed on by the two countries. A line drawn by an Englishman in 1893. That's why it's called the Durand line. It divides the Pashto-speaking people roughly in 2/3, 1/3. You know, these are the kind of things that a regional conference has to sort out. But it should not have the influence of the United States. You know, we don't need these honest brokers, you know, the Norwegians and the Finns and so on, to create an Oslo process and a Madrid process. Ask the Palestinians what the European honest brokers have done for their destiny and their liberation.
one more question.
What do you think will happen? Will Afghanistan look more towards Saudi Arabia or to Iran? Because in Iran they are now happy that imperialism has been defeated, but at the same time they are very worried about what will happen to the Hazaras, and is this part of a kind of strategy of America to put maximum pressure or increase maximum pressure on Iran, given that Iran at one time, at the end of the 90s, wanted to go to war with the Taliban because it had killed a couple of diplomats. So my question is, how do you see it? Do you think it is called the United Emirates of Afghanistan, I think? So is it more looking towards the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and has it already concluded certain deals with the Americans, which the Iranians are afraid of?
So this is a very important question about Taliban's relationship. Now, specifically speaking of the Taliban's relationship with some of the regional countries, Iran, the Gulf countries, United States, and so on. So obviously it's too soon to tell, and the agreements have not been sufficiently leaked, so we don't know. But I have engaged with the Taliban when they were in Doha, and that was very interesting because, see, before 1996, the Taliban was created in the camps in Balochistan, in Peshawar, and in South Waziristan and so on, between around 92 and 94, 95. These were mostly all young men who got to know each other there. They called themselves the Taliban, meaning the students and so on. Baradar was a very important figure in this. Okay, at that time, their only experience was towns like Jalalabad, city. Their only experience was Kaboel to some extent, but it was mainly, not Kaboel. It was in Helmand and so on, and then in Balochistan, in Peshawar. But they had not really been outside the region. So they had a certain perspective they brought into authority in Kaboel in 96 when they came to power. They were immediately ruthless. They went and killed the president of Afghanistan, Muhammad Najibullah, was dragged out of the UN compound and hung, and they took photographs. It was a brutal crime against Najibullah and his brother. Both were killed brutally. Najibullah was the last left president of Afghanistan. Anyway, this Taliban is slightly more mature in the sense that Baradar himself was number 2 in the Taliban, lived in Doha, Qatar, traveled to Moscow, traveled to China and so on. He's seen other parts of the world. By the way, in Doha at their office, they still wore their outfit and so on. But there were computers and the whole setup was there was a slightly different, but they still had an insularity. Okay, I'm just talking about my experiences. Now, they had initially been formed. Their political formation took place in these schools in Pakistan, which had been funded by and used the educational curriculum from Saudi Arabia. That was largely their political formation. But they've spent a lot of time in Qatar and with influence of Turkey. Now the Muslim Brotherhood influence has come. So I don't know what doctrinal role this is going to play. But now Qatar and Turkey, which are the two axes of the Muslim Brotherhood, have a great grip on the Taliban. And the Muslim Brotherhood countries, as you know, are in a clash with Saudi Arabia. So inside the Taliban, there is now some fissures between the pro-Qataris and the pro-Saudis. This is very interesting. I don't know how it will develop. But here's the key. The cabinet they've selected is largely a Pakistani cabinet, if I may put it in those terms. This is largely a cabinet that on paper looks like a Saudi cabinet, Saudi-Pakistani cabinet, not a Qatari-Turkish cabinet. First indication was the Turks said on day number 2, 16th or 17th August, they said, we will like to help you run the airport. When the Americans left, they blew up the civilian buildings. So the Turks said, we'll come back, repair everything, help you. And the Taliban didn't respond. Then when they made Khalilul Haqqani the head of refugees, I found that very interesting. That means that a guy with very close ties to Pakistani intelligence is now going to decide which planes can go with refugees, where will they go, and so on. So this is a very interesting scenario. We have to watch it. It's too early, my friend. Now it's 12th of September, not even 1 month since the Taliban took Kaboel. And so we should not wonder what deals were cut, and we should not speculate too much. I am a journalist who doesn't like speculation. I look at the evidence, ask questions, see what's available. I don't like to have a conspiracy in my head. I want to see what, because reality is a conspiracy enough. You know, we don't need to fantasize beyond. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know what deals will be cut with the Iranians. It's important to say this. In this cabinet, there is not one Hazara minister. Not one woman as well, but not one Hazara minister. Now, the Taliban on the first week of August was saying they were seizing the old Balkh region, you know, Mazar-e-Sharif and so on. The reason they were able to take northern Afghanistan so quickly is that they had Tajik commanders. They took Herat without a problem. They have Hazara commanders and so on. They were sort of signaling in early August, we have some Tajiks, we have some Hazaras, minorities in our ranks. But not one Hazara is in the cabinet, in the ministry. This must have been seen very carefully in Tehran. They must have observed this very carefully, because it's true, the Iranians are very cautious about how the Shias will be dealt with. Not only Hazaras, but other Shia minorities who live in eastern Afghanistan. So they are looking carefully. So I am cautious. I am looking to see what will the Iranians say. Iran has a new foreign minister. A very interesting character. He's not Javad Zarif anymore. You know, now he has a close tie with the supreme leader. So we should see what will the Iranians say. What's the first Iranian trip, big public trip to Kaboel? What will it be like? Who will go from the Taliban to Tehran? Will they go? Or will they meet somewhere else? Sorry, I'm going a little long, but there's one more piece to this. In this 2-week rush to Kaboel, there was a meeting in Baghdad, which was a very important meeting about security of the Iraqis. At the side of that meeting, the Iranians and the Saudis had the first high-profile meeting in 2 years. Face-to-face meeting. Very important development. The Saudis are trying to dial back the debacle in Yemen. So I think we are going to see a period when some of these countries will have to start dialing back conflicts. I'm hopeful. This is hopeful me. That the conflict between Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia will dial down. Because this will help the Yemeni situation. That if this dials down, maybe these countries will be able to put some pressure on the Taliban to basically open up a little bit. And that Hamid Karzai, Abdullah haven't left Kaboel is important. Now, I don't like these guys. These guys collaborate with the Americans. These guys are right-wing fellows, you know. But they are not Taliban. So let's see what they are able to do. And also they are opportunists. Tomorrow, Hamid Karzai will join the Taliban. There's no guarantee he will not, by the way. He's a total opportunist. But they have not left. Let's see what happens. So can we give the country a little bit of time before we start supporting the next CIA undermining of the Taliban government? Please, just 6-8 months at least.
Give Vijay a big round of applause, please. Thank you. I have a lead done, and somebody from Afghanistan will testify for us about his experience and how he feels about the situation.
Bonjour, oui, nous sommes ici avec Amitié sans frontières, met Vriendschap zonder grenzen. Nous avons une journée spéciale aujourd'hui, pas seulement sur l'Afghanistan, mais on est ici aussi avec tout un bus des occupants de l'église de Béguinage qui sont ici, qui sont arrivés, mais ils ont vu la mer et voilà, ils sont allés à la mer. Avec l'Afghanistan, on a eu pas mal d'expériences les dernières années vu qu'on a accueilli beaucoup de familles qui sont venues à partir de 2015-2016, qui sont fuies de Iran, Afghanistan, beaucoup parmi eux des Hazares, une minorité, parce que vous devez savoir aussi qu'en Afghanistan, il y a aussi une grande minorité qui est terriblement opprimée, aussi aujourd'hui avec les talibans. Et c'est ces familles qui sont enfouies à 2015-2016, et beaucoup de eux ont reçu une réponse négative. Ça veut dire on ne croit pas que ce sont des Afghans. Normalement, il y avait la famille Youssoufi qui allait être ici, mais je ne sais pas si vous savez, aujourd'hui, il y a une grande manifestation des Afghans à Bruxelles cet après-midi, et la plupart des gens sont partis, sont restés à Bruxelles, mais on a quand même Sami avec nous. Hein, Sami est plus jeune. Je vais d'abord demander qu'il se présente un petit peu, hein, et je vais poser quelques questions.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Sami, je viens d'Afghanistan, je suis arrivé ici à l'âge de 15 ans. Je suis un réfugié reconnu et je travaille dans un restaurant en toute légalité. Et je suis très inquiet pour ma famille parce qu'ils sont très dangereux et ils ont quitté leur logement et vivent dans la rue à Kaboel. Et je suis très inquiet pour ma famille vraiment et j'ai demandé un visa humanitaire.
Oui. Ah oui. Mais Sami, toi tu es arrivé en 2015 et tu dis que tu as fait 15 ans. Ça veut dire que tu as fait un trajet énorme et tu as quitté ton pays. Pour quelle raison en fait?
En fait, moi je vais quitter mon pays en 2015. Je suis arrivé ici parce qu'en fait, pour arriver ici, j'ai traversé 10 pays. En fait, vraiment, c'est pas facile. Et pour arriver ici, il prend 4 mois. En fait, parce que moi j'avais un problème parce que mon père il travaille avec le gouvernement. Parce que les talibans, quand ils savent que mon père il travaille avec le gouvernement, ils prennent mon père et la met en présence. À la fin, après 3 mois, il est venu chez nous et il va tuer mon oncle. Et puis maman elle m'a dit que tu vas quitter ce pays, sinon il va te prendre à toi aussi, il va te faire le mauvais. Pour ça, moi j'ai quitté mon pays et je suis ici.
Et tu n'avais que 15 ans, mais tu dis que tu as traversé pendant 4 mois. Ça a pris 4 mois pour arriver dans un centre des mineurs non accompagnés.
En fait, pour arriver ici, je prends 4 mois. Quand j'arrivais ici, et j'avais demandé un demande d'asile, et puis elle va m'envoyer dans un centre d'asile, et j'étais là-bas 9 mois. Pendant 9 mois, j'apprends le français, et puis j'ai commencé une formation cuisine en CFA, et 2 jours travail et 3 jours stage. Et puis j'ai commencé à travailler dans un restaurant à Refresh, et heureusement pour l'instant j'ai un contrat indéterminé pour toujours. Et en plus, je travaille dans un magasin le soir.
C'est un trajet réussi parce qu'il y a beaucoup de jeunes qui n'ont pas cette chance, mais tu as étudié, tu as suivi l'école, tu as été dans un centre de mineurs non accompagnés, et à ce moment-là, tu voulais déjà demander un regroupement familial, mais ça n'a pas réussi.
Heureusement, je suis content que je suis être ici. En fait, moi, j'avais demandé un visa humanitaire et mon avocat m'a demandé tous les documents qu'elle avait besoin. Et j'attends pour la réponse. En fait, parce que le ministre spécial va demander, parce que les gens peuvent être trouvés comme le administratif pour un passeport de tout, parce que la famille dans les Afghanistan, ils n'ont pas le papier, un passeport, dans tout, parce que quand il n'y a pas le gouvernement, comment il va trouver un passeport pour venir ici?
Le problème est que des jeunes qui sont arrivés et dans des centres des mineurs non accompagnés, ils ne peuvent pas demander le regroupement familial, tandis qu'ils sont seuls, ils sont des jeunes seuls, mais avant 18 ans, tu ne peux pas le demander. Mais dès que maintenant, il y a une possibilité qu'il peut demander que sa maman, que sa maman vienne avec ses autres frères et sœurs, mais tout sera, toute la discussion aussi dans les pays de l'Europe, parce que est-ce que les gouvernements vont vouloir donner des visas humanitaires pour quand même que des familles se regroupent ici en Europe. De l'autre côté, nous, avec Amitié sans frontières, on se bat beaucoup aussi pour que des Afghans qui sont ici depuis des années, qui reçoivent le droit d'asile. Parce qu'on utilise n'importe quel argument pour refuser le droit d'asile. Tandis que ce sont des gens qui sont ici pendant 3 ans, 4 ans, 5 ans, mais qui reçoivent tout le temps négatif, 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 parce qu'on ne croit pas leurs arguments. La famille Youssoufi, exactement, c'est une famille qui habitait à Kunduz. À Kunduz, pendant le gouvernement du taliban, ils sont allés en Iran pour s'enfuir. Au moment que les Américains sont arrivés, ils ont pensé on est en sécurité, on retourne dans notre pays, on retourne à Kunduz. Puis ils ont vu qu'avec les Hazars, qu'ils étaient tout à fait opprimés, et ils sont allés de nouveau en Iran, et puis ils s'enfuient vers la Belgique. Mais ici en Belgique, on ne croit pas que ce sont des Afghans. Ils disent vous êtes des Iraniens, vous êtes je ne sais pas quoi. Et c'est pour ça qu'ils restent sans papier, sans papier, sans papier. Toi, tu as eu de la chance d'avoir un papier, une bête carte d'identité, mais tu as essayé aussi de travailler et tout ça, et tu as réussi. Tu as étudié, tu as ton travail maintenant, et ton rêve maintenant est de avoir ta maman de nouveau à côté de toi. Et tu vas redemander le visa humanitaire.
En fait, heureusement, moi je suis très content et j'ai un travail et je travaille toujours. Et en fait, moi j'ai un papier et bientôt je vais demander une nationalité belge aussi. En fait, moi je veux bien demander un visa humanitaire pour ma famille qui venait ici en Afghanistan. C'est vraiment assez difficile pour être en plus pour ma soeur de 18 ans. Parce que pour les femmes en Afghanistan avec cette maman, c'est très difficile parce qu'on va faire les filles célibataires et les femmes qui n'ont pas le mari. Elle va faire un mariage forcé. Vraiment, c'est très difficile, pour ça je m'inquiète beaucoup. Et j'espère qu'enfin, j'ai réussi pour obtenir un visa pour venir ma famille ici.
Voilà, c'est un petit témoignage, mais je propose aussi, quand vous connaissez des Afghans autour de vous, de pouvoir en parler. Il y a 8 filles afghanes, mais je ne les ai pas encore trouvées ici qui allaient venir. Il y a pas mal de camarades afghans ici et je vous invite en tout cas de prendre contact avec eux et d'eux. Avec Amitié sans frontières, nous faisons aussi un débat à 2 heures dans le stand syndical pour toute la situation des travailleurs sans papier, et ça ferait du bien de les rencontrer et d'écouter leur histoire et leur occupation au béguinage. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Attention, attention tout le monde. Il y a une bombe nucléaire dehors. Non, c'est une blague. Mais il y a une action contre des bombes nucléaires ici dehors avec les vélos. Dus mensen, hier net buiten is er een actie tegen nucleaire bommen. Ik nodig jullie allemaal uit om te komen kijken en ook om een beetje te komen fietsen. Hein? En oui, on va annoncer qu'il y a une attaque nucléaire. Hein? Donc, allons-y, allons-y.